final part of our journey takes us to Israel, the home of the Jewish people that was reborn as a nation on the 14th of May 1948, fulfilling the words of the prophet Isaiah in chapter 66 verse 8. Who has heard of such a thing? Who has seen such things? Shall the earth be made to give birth in one day? Or shall a nation be born at once? For as soon as Zion was in labour, she gave birth to her children. The modern state of Israel was reborn out of the ashes of the Holocaust, only 3 years after the darkest chapter of Jewish history, in which 6 million European Jews were murdered at the hands of the Nazis on an industrial scale. The day Israel declared its independence, it was attacked by 5 Arab armies, completely outnumbered and outgunned, but survived against all odds. In Israel's short modern history, the Jewish state has been involved in 5 major wars. It was the miracle of the Six-Day War in June 1967 that saw Israel defeat the combined Arab armies of Egypt, Jordan and Syria in just 6 days that led to the liberation and unification of Jerusalem, the eternal Jewish capital. Here we are today to attend the 5th Global Forum Conference for Combating Anti-Semitism, where leaders around the world, experts in their field, including diplomats and government officials, are meeting to discuss strategies to combat the growing rise of anti-Semitism in the world today.
70 years ago, with the end of World War II and the revelation of the horrors of the Holocaust, some believed that humanity would discard one of history's oldest hatreds, anti-Semitism. And it's true that in the years immediately following World War II, blatant expressions of hatred for the Jews appear to take a respite, at least in the liberal West. Yet today, there's no doubt that we're living in an age of resurgent anti-Semitism. Jews everywhere are once again being slandered and vilified. This is taking place in the intolerant parts of the Middle East, but it's also taking place in what otherwise would be expected to be the tolerant parts of the West. It's taking place in Beirut, in Damascus, in Tehran, but it's also taking place, violently so, in Toulouse, in Paris, in Brussels, because along with vilification come the inevitable violent attacks. And Jews are now being targeted for being Jews. Now, Jews have the right to live freely and safely wherever they choose. And governments everywhere are responsible for guaranteeing this right. And I want to take this opportunity to praise all the governments that have been witnessing this resurgent anti-Semitism, their commitment to protect the rights of the Jews, the rights of individuals, the rights of their citizens.
Can you tell us of the importance and significance of this conference today, the Global Forum for Combating Anti-Semitism?
This is a very important forum. It's the biggest conference of its kind in the world for combating anti-Semitism. There are more than 1,200 people who have registered for this forum, from over 83 different countries and 7 different religions. We are here Muslims and Christians, Baha'is, Druze, Hindu, Sikh, and others. This sends a very important and strong message that anti-Semitism is not tolerated and not accepted anymore. that anti-Semitism is not only a Jewish problem. Anti-Semitism is an international problem. It is a problem for the world and for civilization as a whole. The responsibility to protect Jews or for the continuation of Jewish life in Europe and elsewhere always lays in the hand of the respected governments or international organizations. In the case of Europe, it's the European Union and European institutions, or the French government, or the British government, or the Danish government, etc. It's in their hands to protect the continuation of Jewish life in their countries and in the European continent.
What I've been shocked about, Gideon, is going to Brussels and seeing the Belgian paratroopers that are protecting Jewish communities, they're protecting synagogues, they're protecting Jewish schools. And now the extent of the threat from the Islamic State has become so big that outside the European Parliament now, we actually see almost a battalion of soldiers with weapons and guns and machine guns to protect the European Parliament. Isn't there a connection between the protection of the Jewish community and also the protection of European institutions such as the European Union, the European Parliament, and others?
Of course, we say that it always starts with the Jews, it never ends there, it never stops there. When one protects the rights of minorities, when one protects the rights of Jews to live freely in Europe, he protects his own institutions, he protects his own values, etc. Well, you have mentioned the presence of armed guards and soldiers and in front of Jewish institutions, synagogues, schools, etc. in Europe. On the one hand, this is very important because we saw these recent attacks against Jews in Europe. But on the other hand, this is very sad. I mean, you cannot have a free and normal life without these security fences, security cameras, police and soldiers around you. This is the last resort. One has to solve the problem before they arrive into this defense line. And the actions that have to be taken are in the field of education, in the field of the internet, in the field of law and legislation, in the field of enforcement of the laws that exist. These are the first lines. A special problem exists with Muslim radicalism, and we saw that the last attacks in Europe were perpetuated by Muslim radicals, and a special attention has to be given also to this side. But I want to reiterate the importance of the social media today and the importance of the industry, the internet industry, and the big industry companies like Facebook and Twitter and YouTube and the search engines, Yahoo and Google, etc. They have really to put special emphasis to protect the users of the internet from racism or anti-Semitism or hate crimes, etc. If they leave the net just like that, finally the net will become a hostile place for almost every one of us.
And finally, Gideon, if our European leaders don't do enough to protect the Jewish community from the rise of anti-Semitism, particularly terror attacks like we've seen in Europe this year, what is the future for European Jewry?
Well, we already can identify three phenomena in Europe. One is segregation, the second one is immigration, and the third one is assimilation. Segregation, it means that Jewish communities start to withdraw behind security barriers, behind police, security cameras, and to withdraw from public life. This is segregation. The other one is emigration, and we see that the Jews are leaving Europe or consider in very large number to leave Europe. This is also a very sad phenomenon. And the last one is assimilation. You know, Jews take away kippas, mezuzahs from home, every symbols that can identify them publicly as Jews, and they assimilate and lose their Jewish identity in the general public. This is bad for Jews, but I think it is very bad for Europe as a whole, because Europe loses one of its fundamentals. Jews have been living in Europe more than 2,000 years. They are part of European civilizations. They are at the core of European civilization, if you want. And if Europe loses them, Europe will lose a significant part of its identity.
There appears to be an endemic hatred of the Jewish people in the Arab world and in the minds of many European Muslims. Gunther, a leading German academic in the study of anti-Semitism, states in his book that many of the young European Muslims he interviewed hold deep hatred for the Jewish people.
What people say, or young Muslims say why they don't like Jews is, they say, well, it's because I as a Muslim don't like Jews because the Muslims don't like Jews. Or the Muslims and the Jews are enemies, which is obviously not true in this generalized form. But they believe in it, and that becomes part of their identity. Some of them use reference to the Quran or to Islamic history, saying, well, there was Muhammad had fights with Jewish tribes. And of course, you can then question very well, if Muhammad had fights, which apparently was true, as far as we know, and even was responsible for killing some Jewish tribes. But that was 1,300 years ago, and it's definitely not the same Jews as we see today in London and Paris or in Berlin. If you ask them, so why is it that you don't like Jews? They say, so what? I don't like Jews. That is just the way it is. So they don't feel the need to justify it. And that means there's a certain norm in their social circles where they can get by with this. And it also means that that there are not many boundaries then, and it can easily lead to attacks against Jews.
We're looking at extreme Islamist ideology. Can you say what attracts so many young European Muslims to go and join such an evil, hideous organisation like the Islamic State in Syria and also in Iraq? We've examples of young Muslim schoolgirls leaving school to become jihadi brides. Something like over 5,000 European Muslims, and they're saying this is now the tip of the iceberg, a number, are actually joining the ranks of ISIS. What is it that's so appealing to so many European Muslims to want to be part of this jihad against the West and to establish this Islamic caliphate?
When you're young, in general, I think you're looking for a good way to do something meaningful in your life or with your life, as in general. And many young people, not only Muslims today, are unhappy with the situation now. They don't have a future project, what they believe in. And many of the young Muslims are influenced by these ideas that they should work for a society which is ruled by Sharia law. And they see, or they believe, that the Islamic State is the truth and does that perfectly well.
Despite the fact we're seeing horrendous beheadings of Christians, despite the fact we're seeing, the murder of innocent civilians as hostages, the total carnage of, say, Iraqi or Syrian civilization and destroying historical artifacts and destroying any culture, doesn't this shock them? Isn't there a sense of outrage, or what is it that makes them just not have that moral conscience, as it were?
You would think so, but obviously it's not the case. So then the question would be, why is that not the case? There are two arguments, I think. Some to say, well, this is just lies, this is not true. And then some Islamists show them some excerpts, fractions of holy texts, and they show it's written here. This is written in the Quran, and we should follow this. And I think if we don't have the arguments in education from a Muslim or non-Muslim perspective, saying, well, there might be some passages in the Quran or in the Hadith written that might be read as calling for violence, but we cannot accept this, and this must be put into context. We cannot accept this as value. But there are Islamists out there, they say exactly this. They say, word for word, this is God's word, and we should apply it. So then there is a very black and white world, and young people feel attracted by it because they think this is the good way, the way we should live, and that's why they're attracted so much. I mean, it's only a tiny minority, but a tiny minority that can be a huge threat for society in general, not only for Jews. We've seen that.
What policy recommendations would you put to European governments to tackle the very real issue you've explained in this interview so far with Islamic anti-Semitism?
To watch closely Islamist organizations. They even publicly state that education is their goal, and this is how they want to change society, and they want to go away from democracy in a long-term approach by education. And also watching the majority of the imams preaching in European countries today is not trained in Europe. So they are trained in countries where anti-Semitic ideas are very widespread and not challenged at all. So they should be trained in European countries.
Finally, my final question to you is, what is the danger and what is the implications if our European leaders don't get to grips with this rise of Islamic anti-Semitism and stop the incitement and hatred that we're seeing that is encouraging so many young, impressionable European Muslims to go and join such a hideous, hate-filled Nazi-style terrorist organization like Islamic State?
Yeah, we've seen, I mean, this is, anti-Semitic ideology is very much connected to anti-democratic attitudes. So it is and we've seen that also it's clear in the jihadists, they attack Jews, but not only Jews. They attack those who they call Islamophobes, they attack soldiers, they attack policemen, they attack institutions of democratic society, and they even attack just ordinary people.
Here we are in Israel, the only national homeland for the Jewish people. Sadly, today, many world leaders and international governmental institutions blame Israel for the conflict that exists between the Israelis and the Arabs in the world today. This is reflected in many of our universities and schools in the West as truth and academic freedom of expression are under serious threat, as we will now discover.
Amazingly, the universities have traditionally played a role that has been, when it comes to issues of anti-Semitism, often quite negative. And actually, if we look to the Nazi era, the only institution in German society that volunteered to give up its Jewish members were the universities. It's the only institution that literally voluntarily fired the Jewish scholars and professors. The military, the police forces didn't even do this, but the universities did. And I think, in a sense, the intellectual elite in the West are at the forefront of developing and sort of espousing anti-Semitic discourse and values in society today. So it's at the universities that I think have been hijacked and have sort of, in a sense, demonized Israel. Israel's become the Jew among nations. It's delegitimized not only the state of Israel, but the Jewish notion of peoplehood. The Jewish notion of peoplehood is once again under attack, and it's the intellectuals in Europe and in North America that are leading this charge. In the West, we don't know how to react to this reactionary social movement, this radical Islamist social movement. So when I say radical political Islam or Islamism, I'm not speaking about Islam and Muslims, but I'm speaking about a reactionary social movement that is diametrically opposed to Western democratic values, to the very notion of citizenship and equality under one legal system. It's sexist, it's anti-Christian, anti-Baha'i, anti-moderate Muslim, and they're using anti-Semitism as the fuel for their social movement. So while they focus on the Jew and the Zionist and the Israeli, they're actually trying to undermine Western democratic values, and they're doing this by funding and supporting academic research centers, chairs in Middle East Studies departments. Today, Jewish peoplehood is the dominant form of anti-Semitism or anti-Semitism, and it's equally, I would argue, genocidal. People actually believe that radical political Islam will dissipate if only the stubborn Jews would change. So if the stubborn Israelis would change their policies or their boundaries or behave differently, not only will the Jews be saved from themselves, as some of intellectuals and political leaders in Europe and North America and certainly in the United States have been arguing, but not only will the Jews be saved from themselves, but that the Jews, by changing, will bring about redemption and peace in the Middle East and sort of end jihadism. But the jihadists have taken the most pernicious forms of anti-Semitism and infused it in the center of their core ideology. They speak of Jews emanating from animals, from pigs and monkeys, or the urine of donkeys. And we know from history, once a group is so demonized, and they call for the killing of not only the destruction of Israel, but for the killing of Jews everywhere, that once we dehumanize people to such an extent that it justifies subjugation, segregation, slavery, and even genocide. And we know from the history of anti-Semitism that anti-Semitism begins with Jews, but it never ends with Jews. And once this disease of hatred, of a very specific form of hatred, is unleashed upon society, it's not just the Jews that fall victim to this hatred, but others. And I think we have to realize that this is an attack not just on Jews, but on Christians, on women, on religious minorities, and the very core democratic values that we hold in our
Charles,
views.
do you think that academic freedom of expression is under attack primarily because of Middle Eastern nations who are heavily funding our universities in the West, which is distorting students and also lecturers' worldview of particularly the Middle East and the challenge we face in dealing and confronting with the rise of Islamism?
Yes, I would say it's an attack on Western core democratic values and academic freedom, because there's certain types of studies, like the study of anti-Semitism, like looking at radical political Islam in a serious scholarly way, which is frowned upon and has almost become a taboo in some of our finest institutions. And of course, these institutions are training the future leaders of our society, and if they're receiving a substandard education from our finest institutions, we have a problem now, and it will only become more serious in the near future.
Can you tell us the impact this is having on brave and courageous academics like yourself who are willing to make a stand against the rise of anti-Semitism on university campuses throughout the Western world? And what is the cost of standing and confronting the current apathy towards anti-Semitism that we're seeing today?
Students who go against a professor, or students who speak out against anti-Semitism, or even students who join Jewish organizations on campus in the United Kingdom, in France, in Canada, and the United States, pay a price. Because if the demonization of Israel and Jewish peoplehood is coming out of the universities, and if Israel is this sort of racist, apartheid, Nazi occupying entity, and young Jewish kids are on campus going to institutions that are affiliated with this racist apartheid entity, in quotations, or if individual Jewish children, students have a strong Jewish identity and are connected as Jewish people are to Israel, to Jerusalem, to the holy cities in this land, they are suddenly perceived in the sort of political correct environment as being an enemy. So in the name of liberal, progressive, postmodern thought, these students and faculty members are paying a price. We have to understand that this is not a Jewish problem, this is a democratic human rights problem. And if we allow this type of anti-Semitism to fester and to allow these sorts of forces to become entrenched in our university departments, administration, boards of trustees, etc., then we're going to see I think, a rise in anti-Western, anti-democratic, anti-Christian politics. And I think what happened in France a few months ago is a case in point. The Islamists in France were talking about Israel and the Jews and the Jews and the Jews and the Jews, and nobody paid much attention to anti-Semitism or the threat that the Jewish community was under in France. And suddenly we see the anti-Semitic reactionary forces from the suburbs of Paris, who are migrants from Muslim countries. We see that there are cells and, there's basically well-orchestrated soldiers on the streets of Europe today with the capacity to really inflict, horrific terrorism in the heart of democratic Europe. And this time they attacked the Jews, but they also attacked journalists. They attacked the very notion of freedom of speech that we all, in our societies fought to create in our democratic spaces. Freedom of speech, which is the core value of democracy, and that came under attack.
Well, we look at the next generation of leaders, those who are currently at our universities now, that out of our current universities we get our future prime ministers, future chancellor of the exchequers, those who are going to be in very powerful and influential positions in government, making decisions over the rest of us. How important is it that this is actually addressed to ensure that they really know the true realities of the world in which they're living in, and also understanding where a lot of this funding and ideological influence is coming through, so that when these young people then become in professional positions and positions of influence, they can understand the truth and they can make moral decisions on what's true rather than what is being brainwashed through so many of our universities?
It's a great question. On the one hand, it's a strange thing to say, but I almost prefer dealing with Islamists because they're straight, they're honest, and they're clear. They're very clear what they perceive Jews to be. They're very clear what they perceive the West to be. They're very clear what they see democratic societies as being, and they're very clear about trying to usurp democratic societies and impose Islamic law upon society and upon institutions. So they're very clear. We, on the other hand, in the West, our political leaders, our intellectual leaders, our best journalists, and I think this is very acute in the United States. In the American situation I know best, we're living in this sort of politically correct moment where this question and the fact that I will condemn radical political Islam is a taboo. In fact, the government policy of the United States is to engage radical Islamists and not to speak about anti-Semitism and not to speak about human rights. So to engage the Muslim Brotherhood that calls for the elimination of all Jews. Kawadari, their spiritual leader, literally, repeatedly calls upon believers to finish the work of Hitler. The Iranian revolutionary regime stated 2 weeks ago that it's not up for negotiation, that they are steadfast in their commitment, their moral and religious commitment to eliminate the state of Israel and to kill Jews. And yet we in the West cannot speak about radical political Islam because we're being politically incorrect, we're Islamophobic, perhaps we're racist, perhaps we're neocons. And I think this silence in the West is a poison, and it's a dangerous, I think it's even more dangerous than radical political Islam, because if we have a clear, honest discussion about radical political Islam and its influence in our societies and in the Middle East and in the world, and we decide to align ourselves with democracy and steadfastness in our principles and to support those who have democratic principles throughout the world, then we can make changes. If we refuse to even have a discussion when it's politically incorrect to speak about it, we're in serious trouble. In Paris at the kosher supermarket, hours before Shabbat, when Mr. Koulibaly came into this kosher Jewish establishment, he asked the 4 people that he executed if they were Jewish. When they said they were Jewish, he executed them. He's a member of a rabidly anti-Semitic, genocidal social movement which unabashedly calls for the extermination of Jews. And yet, the leader of the free world said it was some random act of violence. Imagine, we have a genocidal social movement that are killing citizens of the greatest, where democracy was founded, are executing citizens on the streets of Paris, and the leader of the free world says it was a random act. And to challenge this at the best universities in the United States, or to challenge this in the New York Times, is perceived as reactionary, Islamophobic, and problematic.
George Deek, an Israeli Arab diplomat, attempted to deliver a speech about peace and reconciliation in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. The moment he started his talk, he was shouted down by pro-Palestinian supporters who chanted their support for terrorism against Israel. And this is one of many examples of freedom of speech and academic freedom of expression being denied at our universities.
Long live the Intifada! Long live the Intifada! Long live the Intifada! Long live the Intifada!
It is very disturbing that many of our Western academic institutions are not encouraging academic freedom of expression and tolerance, but have been hijacked by those who hold deeply anti-Semitic views, are indoctrinating our students and the next generation of future leaders with a distorted reality of the world. Year after year, we see diplomatic initiatives by world leaders trying to implement a peace agreement between the Israelis and the Palestinians. But surely we must question, how can there ever be a genuine and lasting peace when there is so much hatred and incitement to violence directed at Israel from our Arab neighbours? Why are we seeing such anti-Semitism in Palestinian media broadcasts?
Well, the anti-Semitism started in the days of Yasser Arafat. And the reason he started promoting it seems to be he really wanted terror against Israelis. So what he did is he started drawing on Islamic sources. He started having sermons appear on Palestinian TV where religious leaders would quote texts about Jews being the enemies of Allah, the obligation to fight against the Jews, obligation to kill Jews. We heard numerous references from Palestinian leaders referring to Jews as descendants of monkeys and pigs. All of this was coming, I believe, because Yasser Arafat wanted war against the Jews. And without hatred you won't have war. Without hatred you won't have killing. So the anti-Semitism was the means that was used by the Palestinian Authority, initiated by Yasser Arafat, and continues until today by the Palestinian Authority. There are two components to this, at least two components. The first is the depicting of the Jew as someone who is so evil that fighting him then becomes something admirable, becomes a service to humanity. Let me give you a very, very shocking example of how this plays itself out. There's a Palestinian Authority educational magazine which is funded by the PA, which is called, it's a private magazine but funded by the PA. It's called Zayzifuna. And this magazine accepts submissions from the readers as well. Well, a teenage Palestinian girl submitted the following essay, which they published. Now, what did the essay have? She said she had a dream and there were 4 doors. And she opened up each door and there was 3 of them had Muslim heroes behind them, and she had a conversation with each of these Muslim heroes. One of them was Saladin and one of them created geometry. Then the 4th door, who's behind there? Hitler. And she has a conversation with Hitler. And she says to him, aren't you the one who killed the Jews? And Hitler answers her, yes, I killed the Jews because they're a nation that spreads destruction over the world, and I wish you, Palestinians, to have success in dealing with the Jews. And the girl thanks Hitler for the advice. This young teenage Palestinian girl, who thought that Hitler was doing a service to humanity by killing Jews, is a direct result of this anti-Semitism, this hatred of Jews that is promoted by the Palestinian Authority. She is the success picture of the Palestinian Authority education, because she believed, she learned, she concluded correctly that the Palestinian Authority teaches that killing Jews, well, if killing Jews is okay, and if Palestinians who've murdered Jews are Palestinian heroes and we've named schools after them and sporting events after them, well, Hitler, who killed millions of Jews, he's worthy of being in her dream as one of the great heroes of the world.
صبايا حبات يغنوا أغنية صغيرة، نتعرف عليكم؟
أنا لا أخاف البندقية
فجموعكم وهم وقطعان غبية. القدس أرضي القدس عرضي القدس أيامي وأحلامي الندية. يا من قتلتم أنبياء الله الأتقياء، يا من تربيتم على سفك الدماء، الذل مكتوب عليكم والشقاء. يا بني صهيون يا شر البرية، يا قرودا همجية، يا خنازيرا شقية.
Today we're seeing unprecedented levels of anti-Semitism in Europe today, with attacks on the Jewish community, most recently by the Islamic State in Paris and also in Copenhagen. How much is the incitement material that's shown on Palestinian television having an impact on European Muslims and their attitudes towards Israel and the Jewish people?
The danger of Palestinian Authority TV and Hamas TV is that they don't only reach Palestinians. They go out by Nilesat, Arabsat. These are two Arabic language satellites, and Muslims, Arabic language speakers throughout Europe and in fact throughout the world can get these broadcasts. So all of this hate material, all this demonization of Jews, all this promotion of genocide of Jews that the Palestinians are broadcasting to their people, it's not just their people they're broadcasting. They're broadcasting to the entire Arabic language world, whoever happens to be watching Palestinian Authority television. During crisis periods, during conflicts, when the level of incitement goes up, you probably have more people watching Palestinian Authority television. During the war in Gaza, I would guess more people around the world are watching Hamas and PATV when these calls for genocide are probably the highest level. So this hatred, that is, by the way, being funded by all the Western governments who fund the Palestinian Authority. They are the ones responsible for this, because that funding is enabling Palestinian Authority television. They're the ones responsible, and it's impacting throughout the world. It's impacting in Europe as well.
Do you think there is a direct correlation between material aired on Palestinian TV or Hamas TV and attacks against the Jewish community here in Europe today?
I think today the European leaders are waking up. I think they're making a very big mistake, though, in looking for it at a very local level. They're looking in the local mosque. They're looking in the local preacher who might have promoted it. They're looking at the local school. And I think they have to realize that when there is this global hatred that's happening, terrorism in many, many countries in Europe, it's not just the local. Those religious leaders are all getting it from one source, or from many different global sources, and that's what's happening. You've got, and it's not just Palestinian TV at this point. It's Al Jazeera, all of these stations, all of these Arabic language Muslim stations have, on many occasions, very radical hatred. You've got Hezbollah, you've got Hamas, you've got very radical hatred going out, and people are listening around the world. And the individuals are listening, the religious leaders are listening, and then they go and repeat it in their mosques, and they go repeat it in their schools. And if it's not stopped at the source, then it's going to keep going. European leadership, European countries should outlaw the broadcasts within their countries as soon as there's a call for genocide. As soon as there's another depiction of Jews as monkeys and pigs. Why is Hamas TV broadcast in European countries? Why is Palestinian Authority TV broadcast in European countries? It's going to impact not just on Israelis, it's going to impact on their local population as well. In the last year, we have heard on official Palestinian Authority sources 3 of the most lethal and dangerous blood libels throughout history. In the Middle Ages, Jews were accused of poisoning the wells. There would be a plague, there would be mass death, and someone would start the rumor that Jews were poisoning the wells. And then tens of thousands of Jews would be killed because of this. This is a common accusation. Well, after the Gaza war, the Palestinian Authority news, as an official news story, as not an opinion piece, but a news story, said that Israel injected poisons into the water during the conflict in Gaza. About a month before then, during the conflict in Gaza, they said that are answering the Israelis by shooting into their cities is legitimate. Why? Why is it legitimate? This was in the official newspaper of the PA. Why is it legitimate? Because the Israelis are making matzah with the blood of our Palestinian children. Again, horrific blood libel from the Middle Ages. And then they said, and how do we know this? Because they said it's written in the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, the third libel, the third blood libel. The Protocols of the Elders of Zion was a hate book written by the Russian secret police that they presented to the world as if it was actually Jewish plan to take over the world. Hitler used the Protocols of Elders of Zion. He printed it in German, and he had it given out throughout Germany. Look how dangerous the Jews are. Again, you need the hatred if you want to have a genocide. That's what Hitler did. Well, the Palestinian Authority in the last year, like I said, 3 of the worst blood libels in history that brought about the deaths of hundreds of thousands of Jews. Why are they doing this if they want peace? Well, they don't. They clearly don't want peace. They want hatred because they want the elimination of Israel. And this is something they openly say to their people. They don't say it in London in English, and they won't say it in Washington in English, but they say it to their own people in Arabic.
Can you give an example of what the Canadian government has done to stop this level of incitement that leads to anti-Semitism?
Well, what the Canadian government has done, and this is the critical thing, they have stopped funding the Palestinian Authority general budget. What they've said is, you're not promoting peace, you're not involved seriously in a peace process, therefore we're not going to fund you, the government, anymore. What they do now is they fund specific projects that they think are important, and I think this is something that the entire world should learn. If the entire Western world would tell the Palestinian Authority, you are involved in terror promotion, you are involved in anti-Semitism, you are involved in promoting hatred, therefore you don't get a euro from us, you don't get a pound from us, you don't get $1 from us. But we will support projects, we'll help people get along, we'll help better lives, we'll do social welfare projects, but we're not giving the government. And I think if that message would come through from the Western world, it might be the beginning of a change in the Palestinian Authority.
And in your experience in dealing with the issues of Palestinian incitement, terror and violence, what lessons could European governments learn in how to tackle these issues to stop the spread of Islamic terrorism across Europe today?
There has to be a no tolerance for hate incitement, no tolerance for promotion of violence. You can't stop terrorism just the second before the terrorist is about to pull the trigger. You can't stop terrorism the second before he's going to knife someone. You have to stop it at the root, which is the indoctrination level. And that's what's not being done. I think that every potential area where there might be hatred and genocide being promoted there have to be people sitting there listening, tape recording. And then if you get that imam or you get that religious leader who says that Muslims have a destiny to destroy Christians, Muslims have a destiny to destroy Jews, get that guy and put him in jail. Outlaw that hate speech. And it can't just be the calls to killing, it has to be the demonization, because demonization always comes before. Hitler demonized the Jews. Hitler presented the Jews as subhumans before he asked his people to kill them. The Palestinians present Jews as monkeys and pigs before they ask their people to kill us. So the hatred, now it's difficult saying this because I'm a firm believer in freedom of expression, but the Western world has to protect itself today. And if they have amongst themselves people who are demonizing Christians, demonizing Jews, presenting them as subhumans, they have to understand that the next stage after that demonization could be the calls to kill them.
Nobody wants to single out or condemn any religion. After all, freedom of religion is one of our core democratic values in the West. We believe in the right of men and women to choose what they want to believe in. But what happens when this freedom is abused and leads to the death of innocent people?
First of all, the West does realize at some level, however reluctant it is to name things by their true names, it does recognize that war has been declared on it. It's come belatedly to that conclusion as a result really of 2 extreme jihadi organizations. The first obviously was Al-Qaeda, and that was the fallout from 9/11 from September 2001. And then more recently, the progress, seemingly irresistible at one point, of ISIS, of the Islamic State, that many people are reluctant, even on BBC I noticed, they can't help but say things like the so-called Islamic State, or sometimes they'll use the acronym Daesh, which nobody would then understand as being linked to Islam, because nobody knows that that in Arabic is an acronym for Islamic State. And there's this incredible gingerly approach to it. God forbid that anyone should think that there's any connection, however remote, between Islam and terrorism, or between Islam and anti-Semitism. Now, of course, the truth is almost the reverse. Not that all Muslims are terrorists. On the contrary, as we know, only a minority of Muslims are terrorists, but virtually all terrorists are Muslims. That's the problem. And they are generally radicalized Muslims. Their profile is increasingly well known and repeats itself time after time. And now what we see is that the radicalized Muslims tend to be in an age group, let's say between 17, 18 to 30, that they have generally been born, certainly in France, they would have come from Algeria or from the Maghreb. They might have been born in France, but their parents came from there. That they have been exposed to, by the social media, the internet, to the propaganda of Al-Qaeda and its various branches, or ISIS, that they are very alienated from and antagonistic towards Western society in general, or the particular country they live in, whether it's France, where it's very strong, the antagonism, but it could be Germany, it could be Britain, it could be Holland, Belgium, so on. And they hate Jews. Now that is something the mainstream media refused, I would say almost point blank, to acknowledge for more than a decade. I found when I wrote about it and so on, there was an almost zero response to that, a deliberate refusal to address that. That's been slightly dented now, only slightly, but yes, there's a kind of very grudging realization that there's a real hatred of Jews. But again, the refusal to connect the dots is that it's not seen as being an ideology. And in most cases, except perhaps on the far right, which is unfortunate, is it seen as a kind of totalitarian Islamist ideology, which is what it is. That's exactly what it is. This Islamism, I think, is the closest that we can get to something genuinely approaching pre-war fascism and Nazism. In its more extreme versions, like, for instance, the Islamic State, I think it's perfectly legitimate, certainly as a polemical device to describe this as Islamofascist or even Islamo-Nazi, in some ways even worse, the sheer barbaric nature of the actions undertaken. But where I think, again, the media mislead is that they don't really address the fact of the family resemblance between all the different branches of the Islamist movements, including the quote-unquote more moderate versions like the Muslim Brotherhood. Because the Muslim Brotherhood, although they don't engage in actions like ISIS do, but they are actually at the origin. They are the source and the origin of the ideology that's embraced by all these movements, including Hamas, which is a branch of the Muslim Brotherhood. And the brothers were anti-Semitic as well as anti-Western, and committed to the imposition by force, really, of Sharia law, with all that entails, and its attitudes towards a series of cultural and social problems, towards women, towards gay people, and so on and so on, which are extreme. And I think, relentlessly persecutory in many ways. But the Jews always had a special place in this hatred, and Christians to a certain degree as well. So there's a family resemblance between all these branches, and yet you find the American president can, you know, cozy up with members of the Muslim Brotherhood in the United States. He turned a cold shoulder to the present ruler of Egypt, Abdel Fattah al-Sisi, who, in a remarkable action, very little reported in the West, at the beginning of this year, 2015, went to Al-Azhar, the most important Sunni center of religious teaching, and called for a reformation of Islam, because he said that what was happening was the worst thing that actually had happened to the religion of Islam, that the way it was being abused and misused and turning virtually all of the non-Muslim world against Islam. He could see that. And he is cold-shouldered by Washington.
With your foresight and with your vision and with your expertise and knowledge, what does the future hold for Britain and also Europe? A, if we don't stand with Israel, and B, if we don't confront the evil that is anti-Semitism, what is going to happen to our societies?
I think there are 2 pointers that we always need to remember in addressing that question. One is, anti-Semitism throughout history, although it begins with Jews and an assault on Jews as a minority, as a group, as individuals, and now as a Jewish state of Israel, it never ends there. It's a prologue to a much bigger and in many ways more devastating upheaval. So that what we see with the rise of this increasingly violent form of anti-Semitism is the coming potential disintegration of the whole social and cultural and ultimately political fabric. I say potential because there's nothing inevitable in this world, but we have to recognize the warning signals. It's something that has a much bigger significance than what appears at first sight. And this, we could go through a long list of historic examples, but simply say, when Hitler began his war against the Jews, that was the wake-up time for the West, and it didn't wake up until it was dragged into World War II. But as long as they thought it was primarily confined to a war against the Jews, what did they do? They closed their borders to Jews. And they ended up in a war that cost 60 million lives. So I think that we can apply that lesson across the board. The tremendous upheavals going on right now in the Middle East are one of the warning signs, but what is happening in Europe is another. And I don't think that America is immune. I don't think there's any place on earth that is actually immune to that. So anti-Semitism has a very important function at that level, that it's telling us, you know, you are next.
Sadly, Professor Robert Wistrich is no longer with us, as he passed away in May 2015, but his powerful, enduring words should act as a warning to us all. Jew hatred may start with attacking the Jewish people, but it doesn't finish there, until it goes on to destroy our entire democratic freedoms and way of life. That is why Jew hatred is a warning from history to us all.